Hello, and welcome to this podcast brought to you by Argus Media, a leading independent provider of energy and commodity pricing information. In this episode of Metal Movers, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, aluminum scrap, and particularly the ever exciting world of Zorba. My name is Blake Hurtik. I'm the Editorial Manager of Metals at Argus Media, and I'm joined here today by our senior aluminum reporter, John Betz. How's it going, John?
Hey, it's going good.
So Zorba, for the uninitiated, what is this mysterious sounding scrap grade we care so much about?
Well, as far as aluminum and recycling go, UBC is beverage cans. They're like the poster child. Everybody is aware of that. Everybody had let's recycle campaigns when they were like in middle school, and we've all seen the educational adverts from the government and from people trying to encourage us to recycle. But Zorba is another side of that coin as far as aluminum goes and how recyclable aluminum is. But basically, anybody who's driven by an auto salvage yard or a scrap yard has probably seen, at some point, piles of cars stacked up. It's just kind of the landscape. You've definitely seen it, before, and probably didn't think very hard about it, but that's the ingredient for Zorba. That's the main feedstock for it. And basically, once those cars go through the shredder, a downstream system will separate the steel scrap in there from everything else, the non-ferrous scrap. And that non-ferrous scrap that comes out of the shredder, that's Zorba. And most of it is aluminum. There's a little bit of copper and brass and zinc in there as well, and also some non-metallic stuff like, seat foam and dust and dirt. But a good chunk of that is aluminum, and with the right processing, it becomes something that can be remade just the same as a can is. So,
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think when we talk about automobile shredders as being one of the most kind of revolutionary processing, technologies in the scrap metal industry, transformative, really. But everybody tends to think of the steel and iron component of that. But increasingly, automobiles, especially modern automobiles, have more and more aluminum in them, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I think the real advancements in that area are the wrought side of it. So, for aluminum, you've got cast and wrought aluminum, and cast is, complex shapes that are castings like engine blocks and pistons, and wrought is stuff that's kind of like flat, like sheet and plate. And so a lot more aluminum is being used in doors and hoods and body panels. So that's going to definitely change the way that the content of that is, as far as Zorba goes and the ways that it can be recycled.
Yeah, so we're, obviously automotive is important for this. What impacts the Zorba market when we're talking about it from your day to day, and where is that market today? Is it like most other metals, we're seeing elevated pricing?
There's a couple variables that set the Zorba price, and one of the things you have to talk about when it comes to Zorba is, who's the consumer? Because, the U.S. market, we have lots of investment to consume it, in the country. But traditionally, it's been an export market with China and India, and more recently, Malaysia being the big importers of that scrap. There's sort of a trade drama being played out right now, especially with Malaysia and China. But the things that set that price are, some of it is a little similar to UBC in the sense that the exchange price, LME, does sort of set the floor for Zorba pricing, but there's a lot of complex factors on top of it because Zorba is, it's very dirty scrap with lots of other stuff mixed into it. So, I mean, the copper and brass portions are going to trend with the copper exchange price as well, because it can be anywhere from 0% to I think as much as 11% red metals inside Zorba. But lately, copper's been kind of a poor predictor of it because copper has just been bouncing around all over the place. So when you kind of put those things together and you correlate them, there isn't much of one. But yeah, right now prices are about the highest they've been since October, and that kind of lines up with what the LME aluminum prices are doing. So
yeah, it seems like copper is more of an impact when it really spikes. Becomes kind of plays an outsized role during those times.
Yeah, it's a bigger deal in the export market than the domestic market, but yeah, it's just been all over the place, and that's why when you kind of try to do a comparison correlation with these things, they don't line up, and it just looks kind of odd. So
yeah, well, and that kind of gets you mentioned a couple of things there. One being Zorba's not a clean grade from a perspective of it's not all one homogeneous product, right? So how do you look at it? How do we assess it at Argus, basically? Like what kind of grades, how do we differentiate? And then how does that also play into who's buying what type of Zorba?
Well, I think the most important thing in assessing Zorba, if anybody's going to do it, and that we've definitely had our struggles with it as the landscape's changed, is making sure that you pick a metallic content. Off the East and West Coast, we assess a 99.3 package, and a lot of people will say that there's no such thing as a 99. But in reality, we pick up trades that trade at parity with that price as well. Anything 97% metallic content or above will kind of fit into that assessment. But that is the real challenge with Zorba, because when I don't know, again, going back to driving by the scrapyard, just driving down the road and kind of looking over your shoulder and seeing what's piled up there, it's a mishmash of different stuff. It's cars, it's appliances, and so the shredder feed, it's different every time. So Zorba is kind of a moving target, but I think when you pick a specification like we have in our methodology, it becomes a little easier to get a picture of it. But I think the real thing is with China no longer importing Zorba for the most part, or really tightening its specifications. Everybody around the world is trying to pick up the slack and figure out the best way to buy and sell Zorba without their massive influence. It's still going into Hong Kong now, but it's just going in a lot less volumes than it used to. So it creates opportunities for people in the U.S. I mean, right now, the container markets are really difficult, and it's been that way for a long time. So there are definitely processors in the U.S. that have a little bit more of a captive market, because people, especially in the middle of the country, can't get their Zorba to the port as easily. Drayage is bad, trucking is bad, containers are scarce. So basically, the kind of Zorba that everybody generates, around the world, it's going to depend on what they can get paid for it and who's paying for it. So
yeah. Well, like most markets, it's a matter of, I think logistics have impacted every metal for the most part, but I think Zorba might be a little bit more exposed to it given how historically reliant on export it's been. And you hit on China changing its policy as one of the major kind of, I think, challenges exporters probably face. Basically, their primary market dissolved, right? In a lot of ways. Have other consumers stepped up? You mentioned Hong Kong as kind of a midway point. And have you seen any other kind of countries or consumers really kind of step up to that, or also other countries following the lead of China in terms of getting stricter?
Well, Malaysia has picked up most of the slack that was going to China. It's by far, at least from the latest trade data we have, for like late 2021, it's the biggest importer of aluminum scrap from the U.S. And most of that HTS code is Zorba. But even Malaysia has made some changes. I mean, now you're not allowed to have any circuit boards, which is a big part of Zorba. I mean, it's not a big part of it, but it's a big factor, and people grade it because circuit boards, you don't really want that in there. You want that separated out. But they've phased that requirement in on the 10th of January after delaying it a couple times. And then you can only have 0.25% of your weight being non-metallic scrap. So stuff like dirt and seat foam and things that are, in appliances and autos that get mixed in. And for a while, Malaysia didn't have strict requirements the way China did. But now that they're doing it, it's becoming increasingly clear that other people around the world are probably going to follow their lead, especially because in that part of the world, China's sphere of influence is incredibly powerful. There's been talks that they're probably going to push a lot of their neighbors to do it, Vietnam and Indonesia, who are also big importers of Zorba. People kind of talk about them as probably being the next to make the requirements stricter. And only one of them has gone in the opposite direction. Indonesia's become more lenient on what they'll allow. But I think a lot of people, me included, expect that to be kind of a temporary thing.
That's interesting because it seems like so much of what China has pushed for all non-ferrous scrap has been this term, like furnace ready, right? So like requiring less processing once it gets to China or whatever country, and to see someone else kind of go the other way to kind of probably appeal to some of the lower quality sellers is interesting. But I do think though, I mean, at least from like most of the major U.S. recyclers have gotten the message right in terms of investing big dollars in more advanced separation systems, right? I mean, the Schnitzers of the world, the Sims, the SA Recyclings, right? They've got advanced things to make this higher quality scrap now.
Yeah, they have, but there's always going to be an export market for people who can't make the investment or won't make the investment, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to those players. And some of those smaller players will get bought up in the M&A frenzy that we've seen over the past 6 months. At the end of the day, though, there are some people who are only going to upgrade it as much. People don't upgrade their Zorba for the fun of it. I mean, it costs money and it's labor intensive, but it's weighing the costs and the benefits of upgrading it, because if they can do the minimal amount and export it somewhere else, where they'll do the rest of it, that was kind of the business model for a long time. So I think a lot of people are still kind of hanging on to that, but it's kind of going away. I mean, I think the last destination for lower grade Zorba is probably India, and I don't think there's anything on the immediate horizon saying that they're going to change and crack down on that. But again, things seem to be moving in the direction of people tightening their standards for scrap purity.
Yeah, and you mentioned the M&A friends that we've seen, which we touched on in the first Metal Movers podcast we did late last year, focused on the steel side of it, because the steel industry has driven a lot of this M&A, where steel mills buying up scrap yards, which include non-ferrous assets, but they're doing it to secure the ferrous volume out of there. But we've seen a lot of consolidation. A lot of it centers around shredders too. Is that something you've seen really now have an impact, I guess, in terms of just how the market's operating, or is it a little too early to tell?
I think it's a little early to tell, but I mean, I think just fundamentally, the story plays out the same no matter what commodity you're talking about. That as there's consolidation, there's some parts of the market that rely on some of those relationships with mom and pop and smaller companies. They're going to have less pricing leverage, and I think a lot about the domestic Zorba processors, because in the U.S. you have two kinds of consumers. You have people that put that Zorba through a heavy media plant and they make a cleaner scrap package called Twitch, and then you have those that buy the Zorba and their product they make from it is alloy, so they skip just selling the Twitch and they just use it themselves. And I think both of those kinds of consumers, I mean, inevitably, I think there's going to be some level of squeeze put on them as their smaller customers they used to do business with get snapped up. They're just naturally going to lose some of that leverage, and it'll be interesting to see whether there's capacity in the U.S. that to see whether everybody can survive this, because I'm assuming that the M&A we've seen over the past few months isn't the end of the story. I mean, I think there's tons of rumors swirling around, and I'm not going to go into any of those, but there's some really big things that could happen in the next 6 months if any of them are true, and which would be definitely have a bottom line impact for the Zorba buyers in the U.S. and abroad as well, but especially the U.S.
Yeah, I think basically if you own a large-scale scrap company, we probably heard your name rumored as being bought by another one or a steel mill. So it's not worth mentioning specifics because everybody's been mentioned, I think, for the most part. But it's been a wild year for sure. There's a lot of cash floating out there. Well, and so John, I wanted to kind of maybe end our talk on maybe shifting a little bit to kind of some of the new developments we're seeing in the aluminum space. You've been covering and tracking a lot. Particularly around some initiatives from aluminum producers. One of them being the Estrella project or product, I guess you could say, and also Novelis's announcement of basically utilizing ELV or end of life vehicles more. And so what should people make of these kind of things where things are moving?
Yeah, I mean they're all pretty interesting, but it sounds for the most part that they're pretty early days. Because I'm such a big nerd about Zorba. Particularly, I was just waiting on the edge of my seat for Alcoa to put out their fourth quarter earnings, because that would be the first one they've done since they announced Estrella, which for anybody who hasn't read about it, currently, the raw material mix for primary aluminum, pure aluminum, is bauxite, which gets turned into alumina, which gets turned into aluminum. But right now, that's the only way to do it. And for the most part. And so Alcoa is going to not only take aluminum scrap and make high purity aluminum out of it, they're going to take Zorba, which is among the dirtiest aluminum scrap you can find. So it's going to be what requires the most cleaning up. So they announced that in November, and in their earnings, they said that they're going to have something ready, a test scale plant ready in 2023. They say that it works on the quote bench scale right now, which is a little bit non-specific, but the 2023 deadline kind of gives us an idea of where to look next. And the Novelis announcement was also pretty interesting. They're going to be opening up a cast house recycling operation next to their automotive sheet finishing line in Kentucky. And in the story, the release they put out, they said that they were going to use end of life vehicle scrap, and I got to interview Tom Boney from Novelis, and we talked a little bit about it. And the thrust of it is right now they're not 100% sure how they're going to do it, but they're working with the OEMs to the automotive OEMs to figure out how they can integrate some of the scrap into the product. So that one's also relatively early days, but it does seem like there's been a lot of motion on this over the past 3 months. Announcements that I never would have dreamed of being made, anytime soon. So things are moving, seem to be moving more quickly in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of ironic when you talk about the scrap industry, which is at its core recycling, but you're seeing kind of at the end user, whether it's an automaker or something, with trying to reduce carbon footprint, carbon emissions in every kind of link of the chain, where I think you now see even more potential investment or potential for guys that are already recycling a lot of metal to even do further kind of new things to keep increasing yield and use for end of life everything, right? So yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Well, good, man. Well, John, I love nerding out over aluminum with you. It's always a pleasure. Appreciate you taking the time today. Any final words?
One thing that I wanted to mention is kind of a interesting occasion that we're having the podcast today. The Argus Midwest transaction price, which is the U.S. delivered price for primary aluminum, that's at an all-time high as of today, which is pretty interesting. So these markets continue to rally, and I kind of thought that I would get a breather at the beginning of this year after 2 years of COVID and all those disruptions, but 2022 sounds like it's going to still be a roller coaster.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to hold my breath to find that quiet market time because I don't think it exists. But that's what makes it fun. So
yeah, great.
Well, thanks, John. And thanks for listening today. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please tune in to our other episodes to learn more about the metals market. This Metal Movers series covers a variety of things. Pretty cool and really showcases the coverage we do here at Argus. For more information about aluminum scrap or any metal at all that we cover, please visit argusmedia.com. Thanks so much. Have a great day.